Well, thank you, Senator Xenophon. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too would like to rise and make some comments on this matter of public importance. But can I say from the outset that Senator Xenophon is embarking here on a political stunt, and the facts that he is relying on are flawed, and his rationale is flawed, and his proposals are flawed. And let me step through those one by one. He finished his contribution by saying that the government's approach would mean that Australia would not have Australian workers working in an Australian company with sovereign control over IP, generating products that we could export. Now, I know, because industry come around and brief members and senators frequently, I know they have briefed Senator Xenophon. Now, clearly I wasn't there in his briefing, so I don't know what was said. But what I do know was what was said in the Economics Inquiry on the 4th of April, when Senator Xenophon asked Saab, parent company in Sweden, now Australian company in Adelaide, about the value of their work, billions of dollars, about their workforce, about their IP, and he knows, because he's been told in public, and I would lay odds on the fact he's been told in private, that companies like Saab, which, yes, had a foreign parent but now have Saab Australia, have nearly 400 people, all Australians, working in Australia on sovereign capability where we own the IP, we are exporting that product overseas with the support of this government. And so the whole premise of Senator Xenophon's point is flawed, and he knows it. Just because the facts do not align with his political narrative, unfortunately that has not stopped him from undermining the confidence of people around Australia, and particularly people in South Australia, about the government's not only plans but commitments and investments towards the National Shipbuilding Program, which goes to industry capability and the capability that our men and women will take to sea. Can I say Saab is not the only company in this place? Senator Xenophon's contention is that if it's not a company that people immediately recognise as an Australian company, then somehow they're not real jobs, that we don't have IP and we can't export. Well, I'd invite him to go and speak to the Australians who work at Thales, who produce things like the Bushmaster and the Hawkeye. Another example of a company that has come and embedded in Australia with an Australian CEO, an Australian workforce, developing Australian IP, real military capability and exporting it. They also happen to employ nearly 3,200 Australians, 3,300 BAE Systems, and again, IP around things like the NOLCA, involvement in shipbuilding programs. The very premise of Senator Xenophon's argument is flawed. What he also ignores is the lessons we have learned from programs like Air Warfare Destroyer and even things like the Armidale Patrol Boat. Now, he mentioned that as an Australian-built boat, and it is a great vessel. One of the reasons we had problems with that in its through-life support was that the designer of the vessel was not part of the consortium that were looking after the through-life support. And so when they started getting fatigue issues, there weren't the immediate informed steps required to address that. And one of the lessons we've learned from Air Warfare Destroyer, and Senator Xenophon well knows because he's sat in the inquiries where we've had to see Navantia as the designer brought back into the mix, is that it's important that the designer and the builder are joined at the hip in terms of building a complex warship like C-5000 will be. And so the government in this tender has not gone out and said, contrary to what Senator Xenophon has said, that Australian companies cannot participate. What we have said is they are not mandated. Particular companies are not mandated. There is nothing to stop a company that we have let a contract to saying we will engage with Austal or we will engage with ASC if that's what they choose to do. But the lesson we learned from AWD is that it is critical that the designer and the builder, the people who are managing the program, are joined at the hip so we don't repeat some of the lessons that saw some of those very early poor productivity outcomes on AWD. We also learned that the issue is not about the workers. As we've seen with AWD, by Ship 3, they are now at world's best practice. Well, guess what? Ship 2, the quality of the work was also great, and Ship 1, whilst they were ramping up, the individual workers' quality was nearly always tip-top. It was the broader management and alliance and governance issues that let that program down. Now, Senator Xenophon should know, because he gets briefs from industry, and just last week the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, which I chair, had Australian industry players come into this parliament specifically to talk about workforce requirements for the National Shipbuilding Plan and specifically C5000. Now, the very clear message that came out of those people is that they are already investing in infrastructure, in ramping up the size of their companies, because they see the government's commitment through the Defence Industry Policy Statement is a paradigm shift from where we have been in the past, where the start-stop programs over decades, the 6 years of Labor doing absolutely nothing to stimulate or contract for new ships during their time in office, this government has not only let new contracts, is tendering for more, but the fundamental input to capability that industry forms has now been formally recognised through the First Principles Review, and the Defence Industry Policy Statement makes it clear that we see that long-term value for money for the taxpayer means having capability for our Defence Force that is affordable and available and is suitable for the task over its life of type. And that means that we need to have Australian industry who are capable to actually form the supply chain and also be involved in the management of the IP, to have all the design artefacts, the capacity to actually understand what those design artefacts mean so that they can repair, modify and certify those ships as safe for use. And so this government is putting in place not just the policy, but the funding and the contracts, and people in South Australia will see in the very near future, because the contracts are being let, things like the development of the new ship site at Osborne for these ships to take place, to be built. And so what we see is a government that has for the first time committed to a continuous shipbuilding program in order to give our Navy the capability they need when they need it, fit for task, supported by an industry that is sustainable. The industry have welcomed this. We have seen in that meeting I had last week with the industry players their commitment. We've seen the purchase of Techport from the South Australian Government. We've seen the creation of the Naval Shipbuilding College, which is to be based in Adelaide. We had a lot of discussion last week, and the clear message from industry was that they are concerned, far from saying there'll be thousands of South Australian workers out of work, they are concerned that there will not be enough workers who are skilled to actually fulfil these programs. And so we had lengthy discussions about how they and the government could partner with the upskilling of people, whether they're coming out of the auto industry, whether they're coming out of ASC off the AWD program, or whether they are kids who are still in school who are going to be employed in 10 and 20 years' time because of the investments of this government. And so the whole premise of Senator Xenophon's motion to this chamber today is flawed. The government is investing. It is investing, taking the lessons from the past to make sure that we have a capability that is supported by an Australian workforce generating Australian IP controlled by management that is here in Australia that has the capability to export. That is the absolute essence of the National Shipbuilding Plan. That is what industry is working towards. And the final thing I would say to Senator Xenophon is if he is concerned about jobs for people in South Australia, and he's been out on the stump many times about the valley of death caused by the Labor Party doing nothing for 6 years, then how is deferring the tender, how is scrapping this tender and going back to reissue a tender and extending this whole process by another 6 to 12 months going to help workers who are looking forward to the start of the OPV program and C5000 by 2020, which this government has brought forward in order to stem the valley of death that was created by those opposite. I do not support this motion because the Australian government has put in place a framework that will give our Navy the capability they need and give Australian industry and therefore generations of Australians high-skilled jobs for decades to come.
Senator